Good morning. I'm Ted Banning, and I'm speaking on behalf of myself and Kevn Gibbs about a Yarmoukian site in Wadi Quseiba, northern Jordan. Wadi Quseiba drains into the Jordan Valley about 10 kilometers south of the modern city of Tel Shamalia. The site I'm talking about today lies on the north bank of the wadi, about 3 kilometers east of its mouth. The site was discovered during a survey we conducted in 2012 and 13. The goal of that survey was to discover late prehistoric sites, and especially Neolithic sites. And to do that, we employed a program of Bayesian optimal allocation based on a predictive model in order to focus our survey in the most efficient way possible. It resulted in the discovery of several certain and probable Neolithic sites. One of these, which we later named Tabaqat ar-Retoubah, is a Yarmoukian site that occupies a stream terrace in the lower part of Wadi Quseiba. We found artifacts eroding out of the colluvium at the toe of the slope on this terrace, as well as along a crude bulldozer cut that makes a pathway through the site and along a gully that bisects the site. As compared with the pre-pottery Neolithic B and the early Bronze and later periods, the pottery Neolithic is relatively poorly understood. The Yarmoukian culture is the first phase of the pottery Neolithic, and in this part of Jordan, Yarmoukian sites are virtually unknown. Our project focuses mainly on the pottery Neolithic, including the Yarmoukian and the Wadi Rabba cultures, which occurred in the southern Levant precisely at the time when agriculture was becoming the dominant economy. Most of the known sites of this period are relatively small, although there are major exceptions, including Ain Ghazal, near Amman, and Shar Hogalan on the banks of the Yarmouk River, close to the Sea of Galilee. Excavations at the latter site by Yossi Garfinkel's team uncovered large building complexes that may have been associated with multi-family households. This and other evidence from the Yarmoukian points to a period of considerable social complexity and not the Dark Age that was once assumed to occur at this time. However, despite the likely importance of the Yarmoukian for understanding social change during the Neolithic, we actually know very little about Yarmoukian society. The site that's the subject of our paper would have been about a 20-kilometer walk from Shar Hogalan. Our site is also only about 14 kilometers from Munhata, our Yarmoukian site on the west side of the Jordan Rift Valley. In 2014, we did some test excavations at the site, marked in red on the map, and in 2018 we came back to the site and exposed some larger areas by excavation, marked in green. We hoped these excavations would help us characterize the site in terms of its size and stratigraphic sequence, as well as to obtain a large enough sample of pottery and other artifacts in order to study the changes in material culture at the site over the course of the Yarmoukian. In future, we also plan to study distributions of micro-refuse across the floors of the buildings discovered in the excavations. We were able to expose parts of the earliest occupation at the site, mostly near the foot of the slope, where it's truncated by the Wadi Channel. This early occupation consists of many pits cut into the whitish marl, and these pits contained loose, ashy sediment containing many Yarmoukian artifacts, including one broken stone figurine. We were also able to expose small portions of this early occupation level in the deepest parts of our trenches in the upper parts of the site, where we also found pits cut into marl. Stratigraphically above this, we find evidence for mud brick architecture, and higher still is stone architecture, with Yarmoukian artifacts found throughout the sequence. We were able to make somewhat broader exposures of these upper levels that contain stone architecture, exposing the plan of a relatively well-preserved oval building. The oval building was constructed above a rectangular mud brick building, whose corner is just caught by our excavation area, as well as some earlier stone architecture that underlies the south end of the building. The southwestern portion of the oval building is missing because of erosion on the slope. The pottery we found at the site contains most of the range of Yarmoukian vessel types, including deep bowls, and both whole-mouth jars and necked jars with loop handles. Many of the sherds show decoration, usually consisting of horizontal, diagonal, or chevron-shaped bands of incised decoration separated by areas of red slip. as in the examples at the top of this slide. Painted sherds are rarer and include one example of alternating red and white triangles, several examples of broad painted chevrons, and at least one example of wavy lines. The small neck jars typically have vertical loop handles, and the whole mouth jars sometimes have a knob or a small ledge handle just below the rim. Most of the bases are flat or disc bases, but we have one example of a pedestal base shown at lower left. Although we see typical Yarmoukian pottery throughout the sequence, one of the things we've noticed in our preliminary analysis is that the execution of the incisions in the pottery seems to be much cruder in the upper levels of the site. All of the incised pottery in the deepest levels at the site, as well as some of the pottery in later levels, looks a lot like the pottery in the upper left of this slide, with relatively deep and evenly spaced incisions. By contrast, and as illustrated by the other three sherds on this slide, some of the pottery exhibits shallow and somewhat sloppy incision, often lacking the panels of red slip that more typically occurs on the better executed pottery. If this pattern of change in the decoration holds as we continue to analyze the stratigraphy of the site, our analysis might allow us to subdivide the Yarmoukian, which is more typically treated as kind of a monolithic entity. Since the Yarmoukian lasted for something like 700 years, it would not be unreasonable to expect it to have changed over that time. Although the pandemic has interrupted our petrographic analysis of the assemblage, preliminary analysis indicates a wide variety of fabrics, including one fabric with basalt inclusions. Since basalt does not outcrop within Wadi Quseiba, but does occur in wadis a few kilometers to the north, it's possible that these represent sherds that were imported to the site from elsewhere. As you can see in this Google Earth image, there are extensive outcrops of basalt about 10 kilometers north of our site. The lithic assemblage from the site is mainly pretty expedient, with relatively few formal tools. Even sickle elements are surprisingly rare at the site. We found one broken projectile point on the surface of the site, and we have one example of a flaked and ground axe. Not surprisingly, we found several examples of upper and lower milling stones in the excavations. We've analyzed some of these for starch residues, and the one at lower right appears to have been used for some kind of legume, most likely pea or lentil. But we also found several examples of irregular pieces of chalky limestone with deep circular depressions in them. The function of these pieces is unclear. Only the one at upper right shows any striations that could have been caused by rotary motion inside the depression. The others instead show chisel or pecking marks and no evidence of any kind of grinding. So it seems unlikely that they would be door sockets, and the stone is too soft for them to have served as mortars. Among the more unusual finds from the site are a couple of incised pebbles seen at left. The top one shows random incisions all over its surface, while the bottom one has geometrical arrangements of short linear incisions. We also found an example of what would normally be called a shaft straightener. However, the rounded triangular shape of this one suggests that it may also have symbolically represented female genitalia. Although we didn't find any complete figurines in the site, we did find evidence of two broken figurines. The one at left is either the top or the bottom of a very highly stylized incised stone figurine. This was found in one of the pits in the earliest level at the site. At upper right are two views of a leg broken from a clay figurine that originally would have looked similar to these ones from Sha'ar HaGolan. It was found in a deposit underlying the oval building, right about here. Other small finds from the site include probable spindle whorls. The one at left is a biconical clay spindle whorl, and the one at right is a pierced stone disc that may also have served as a spindle whorl. Considering that we normally find at least poorly preserved animal bone fragments at other Neolithic sites that we've excavated nearby, we were surprised not to find any mammalian bone at all at this site. In fact, the only faunal remains we found consisted of several pieces of crab carapaces and crab claws, one mussel shell, and considerable amounts of snail shell. We considered the possibility that this might be due to diagenesis. even though we'd expect that any chemical conditions that would be destructive of bone would also be destructive of the crab carapaces. And we measured the pH of almost every sediment that we excavated. We could expect pH levels below 6 to be destructive of the inorganic components of bone, like bioapatite, but the pH of our sediments, not surprisingly, clustered around 8.4. This indicates slightly alkaline conditions, as you'd expect in a limestone region, so we can't explain the lack of bone by the acidity of the sediments. Possibly the people who used the site were just particularly thorough about dumping their refuse into the nearby stream. But if that's the explanation, it begs the question of why they weren't as careful about disposing of crab remains. We've also explored the possibility that the snail remains are contemporary with the Yarmoukian occupation of the site. Radiocarbon determinations on 2 of the shells came out 2 to 5,000 years older than the Yarmoukian period. This would seem a plausible offset from the reservoir effect, making it likely that the shells are indeed contemporary with the Yarmoukian. A small proportion of these snail shells consisted of Helix engadensis, which are edible, but we have no evidence that they were actually eaten at the site. In fact, most of the snails are a very small species, far too small to have served as a human food source, such as Cerocrassa stimulata, and at least one species of Oxychilius. While these don't tell us anything about foodways at the site, they are important indicators of the environment around the site. For example, some of the snail species are ones that would have had a streamside habitat, and this is consistent with other evidence that the stream flowed right at the southern edge of the site during the Yarmoukian, probably in connection with the alluvial deposit you see in the Wadi cut here. We've also obtained radiocarbon dates on small twigs and other short-lived materials in order to get a sense of how the strata at the site fit into the Yarmoukian. Here you only see 3 examples, but all of the radiocarbon dates we have so far from deposits from the early and intermediary layers at the site date approximately 6200 to 6000 BC. The fact that these dates are close to a plateau in the calibration curve with several wiggles in it has a negative impact on the precision of our dates. But there remain several enigmas about this site, and we hope to get back to excavating there before too long. One goal for our next field season will be to uncover the mud brick building that underlies the oval building, and to collect micro-refuse samples from the floor. We'll also want to explore further the possibility that the stratigraphic sequence at the site provides evidence for changes in material culture over the course of the Yarmoukian, and in particular in the conception and execution of the decoration on the pottery. This might in future allow a more fine-grained chronological typology for the Yarmoukian, and would also fit our research theme of exploring social changes during the Neolithic. I thank you for your attention, and I thank the people and institutions named on the slide for helping to make our project possible.